Welcome back, everyone, to Neighbors in the Network. I'm James Pinedo, your host. Today, I'm joined with a very special guest, Russ Latino, the founder of Magnolia Tribune Institute. He was nominated by our very special guest, Jim Sturgis, who I had a wonderful conversation with a few months ago. And now I'm so excited to welcome Russ. Russ, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. I don't know if I'm going to live up to Jim, though. He's a special guy.
He is, but we're not trying to live up to anyone. We're just going to enjoy a conversation. So tell me, how did you grow up? How did that shape you?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Like everybody else, there's a lot of stuff that happens in life that I think ends up kind of shaping the way we see the world. I was born in a charity hospital in Independence, Louisiana, which is a little town that's about 50 miles north of New Orleans, to a mom who didn't graduate from high school, and in a family where nobody had ever gone to college before. We moved around an awful lot. My dad was a construction worker. My mom, eventually, when I was about six, got a job at Walmart, started as a cashier, and then worked her way up into management. But from a very, very early age, she instilled in us the importance of education. I still have very vivid memories, of 4 and 5 years old, sitting down every night and reading with my mother. And so my oldest sister ended up being the first person in my extended family that went to college. I ended up being the second person in my extended family that went to college. But along the way, we lived in a lot of different places and had a lot of different experiences. Started in Louisiana, was on the Mississippi Gulf Coast for a little while, lived in Tennessee for a little while. I think growing up in a setting where finances aren't always secure and it's not real clear from a stability standpoint of how things are going to go down. I think you learn a lot of respect for when you do have things to be grateful for them.
Hmm.
And I think my parents also did a good job of reinforcing the idea that sort of this concept of richness didn't necessarily tie to a bank account, right? That ultimately there was so much more to richness to life, the relationships that you've got, the knowledge that you can obtain and use, and all of those things. At the time, you don't really realize you're learning those lessons. But I think when you get older and you have a time to reflect on kind of where you've been, you realize that stuff was formative.
How did your parents instill that? I think I love that, how richness is not tied to the whatever the number of zeros are in your bank account. It's very much the Frank Capra look at life, one of my favorite directors. And
Sure.
and I'm just curious, how did they impart that?
And so, first of all, I'd say that's my favorite Christmas movie of all time, and I'd also say that my wife is always like, "Isn't it a bit depressing?" I was like, "No, not really." At the end, not really. You know, I think some of it was intentional, and I think some of it's just experiential, right? That you begin to realize that the things that are important in life, are relationships. They're the way that you conduct yourself. It's sort of this concept around integrity and the value of your name ultimately being as important than anything that you can earn, right? Because in the long run, those things are the things that people remember, right? It's how you have longevity, regardless of what your career path is, regardless of what you do in life. And so I think sort of institutionally, there were just values that they taught and reinforced over the course of my childhood that ultimately kind of helped to shape the way that I see the world and think about things. It is interesting to end up in a world that is focused on politics and policy and all this kind of stuff because my parents very much so were apolitical.
Hmm.
I can't ever remember a political conversation in my house. I can't ever remember a conversation about going to vote in my house. I can tell you though, when I was 12 years old, I got a television set in my room, and it was the first time I'd ever had a TV in my room. And at that time period, uh, we didn't have cable, so it was all sort of public access or the traditional three networks. And the Rush Limbaugh television program was one of the things that I could get. And
Hmm.
so at 12 years old, I started to watch Rush Limbaugh and was kind of just fascinated by this guy who was, gregarious and at times bombastic. And but very opinionated and very forceful in the way that he presented the world. And a lot of ways that helped to start me on the path of thinking about politics and policy. Now, that thought process evolved over time, but it was really just like a crazy lark thing that I got a TV and somehow ended up watching Rush Limbaugh. So um, yeah, but my parents were never super political.
So what did they think of their son? You said you were 12, right? When you started?
Yeah, yeah.
What did they think of their 12-year-old son watching this political commentator?
I, for as long as I can remember, my parents and my family have joked that I was either 8 or 80. And so, I was the Alex P. Keaton of the family that would like put on a tie to walk around the house because I just thought it was the right thing to do. So I was always a little different, James, is what I'm saying. I don't think they thought anything of it other than the fact that, he's either 8 or 80 and he seems to have found something that he's fascinated by and it doesn't seem harmful. So have fun with it.
Well, did Limbaugh's views kind of coincide with their own, or did they think of them as a little bit strange?
When I say apolitical, I really mean it. So I don't ever remember conversations about conservatism or anything like that in the family. I think instinctively my parents were probably conservative, and some of that had to do with a religious background
Hmm.
that got brought into the family. But I don't think they sat around thinking about tax or regulatory policy or anything like that. For me, I think I gravitated towards this idea of faith, family, and freedom
Hmm.
that for a long time was sort of the hallmark of what it meant in that era to be conservative or Republican. And I don't know, it just kind of stuck with me.
That makes sense. Okay, so you're 12 listening to Rush, and then
Yeah.
and then you're going through high school, not thinking about politics, but clearly something started to click. What were you pursuing there towards the end of high school and then into college?
Yeah, so I love sports, but I was not a particularly good athlete, and so there was a point very early in high school where I realized that wasn't going to be for me. Um, I did enjoy speaking though, and I enjoyed debate, and so I ended up in high school doing all the stuff that nerdy kids who can't play music and also who can't play sports do: mock trial, youth legislature, Model UN, Lincoln Douglas debate across the board. I did all that stuff. And to me, it was like finding an art form, finding something that I felt like I was kind of uniquely good at. And then when you find those things, they tend to be the things that you become passionate about, right? And so, if you were to look at Russ at the end of high school years, you'd see a guy that was thoroughly engrossed in how do I win combat sport through debate.
Hmm. Is this something, because I've always enjoyed chatting with people like that, but not wanting to argue because I'm not a fighter that in that same way. Do you think yourself as a pugilist, really that way, that blood sport that you just mentioned right now?
I wouldn't consider it a blood sport.
Okay.
I would tell you that I probably mellowed a lot from 17. Um, but I do think at some level, I practiced law for a while too.
Mm,
And at some level, it was the same concept, right? It's competition um, outside of an athletic arena, right? It's you versus another person, and what's at play is how quickly your mind's going to work,
mhm.
or how well you string together arguments or find sources, and so I think there is a natural element of sort of competition at play with that. But also the realization at some level, and this is why I actually, not to jump too far ahead of my life, but it's why I actually think what I'm doing now makes more sense because when I was in the practice of law, that was very much, hey, we've got a concrete case. It'll last until X date. At the end, we're either going to win, lose, or settle, right? And when it's over, and you move on to the next thing. And I think that's not the world that we live in now. If you're talking about policy or you're talking about debating important issues in the public sphere, those are things that don't necessarily have end dates. And at
Mhm.
the end of the day, they're not as micro in the impact. So a single case that I was litigating, as an example, at the end of it, I might have an insurance client or bank or whoever I was representing happy with the outcome of that discrete case, but didn't always feel like, hey, I'm making a big social impact. I think the greatness of bringing that sort of thought process into the world of public policy or into the world of public discourse is that the things that you say and do ultimately can have a much larger impact on a much greater number of people. And so I think that's what's exciting about it now and has been for a while.
Would you say then that you were motivated? What motivated you to go into law besides the fact that you were good at it? You had a propensity for it.
Um, I'd always been interested in it. I'd always, to go back to my joke about Alex P. Keaton, in my mind, there was a 20-year plan. And it involved practicing law for a while, and it involved in getting in politics and
Mm.
so on. And that ended up not being the full path that I've taken, which I think is a blessing. But I think there was an element of, yeah, you're good at this, and because you're good at it, you do get more joy out of it, right? Like there's this sort of self-exploration that happens where you push yourself to figure out, okay, I'm in a really challenging situation, or my client's in a really challenging situation. What can I do to solve this problem for them,
Mm.
right? How do I construct a case or an argument that yields the best result for somebody, knowing that the impact can end up being very big, particularly for individual clients. And so, there was an element of self-satisfaction just in feeling like I was pretty decent at it. There also was an element, I think, of satisfaction of knowing that, like, if you did a good job, the end result was that you helped somebody solve a problem that maybe they thought was unsolvable.
Mm. That makes sense. That makes sense. It seems like that wouldn't be the norm, that sort of desire to help people solve problems for most people in law school. Did you find you were a little bit different from your other law school students around you?
I would say that there are a lot of people that have that mindset, at least going into it, right? I mean, there is a fair amount of desire to be Atticus Finch, and I think some of that gets bred out of you if you end up
Mm.
practicing law and you get used to sort of the monotony of in the practice of law discovery, which takes months and months to do, right? And it's all exchanging interrogatories and requests for production, all these things that nobody outside of law really knows happened.
Mhm.
And it's tedious. And I think that tedium sometimes probably takes away the desire that a lot of folks who go through law school have to go out and make a difference, right? To be this real advocate. But I certainly ran into a lot of people who wanted to be advocates. And an awful lot of them across the board, regardless of whether they ended up at a big firm doing defense work or a plaintiff firm or in a prosecutor's office or whatever, have maintained that. And sometimes they maintain it in unorthodox ways. They might do pro bono work, right? They might do volunteer law work. And so I don't want to say that I was unique compared to other people in law school in the sense that I think a lot of folks had a desire to make a difference, find solutions. I think their natural sort of tendency, like mine, was to say, hey, I've got this skill set that I think makes it such that I would be good at helping people find solutions through the practice of law.
Mm.
Um, Now, I think over time, the practice of law is one of those things that can grind on you a little bit, and that happened to me, right? There was a point in my practice where I really sort of had this thought process that said, there are other things that you can do that I think will have a bigger impact. And that process played out over many years, but played out.
Were you doing the whole associates working 80, 90, 100 hours a week and for months, that sort of years stretching on?
Yeah, so it was, I worked hard. I don't know that it was ever 100 hours a week. I think sometimes those numbers get inflated so people can pat themselves on the back. But I worked hard. I think for me, I'll step back for a second and say, from when I was in college all the way through the practice of law, I was involved in the world of policy and politics.
Mm.
So I was writing articles, I was going on the radio and talking about issues that were percolating in Mississippi. I wrote white papers for the Mississippi Center of Public Policy when I was practicing law, kind of as a side thing. So I was always doing something related to that, right? Took on a number of cases where I represented the legislature in litigation and things like that. So I never lost the desire to be in that world, even when I was practicing. In 2014, I've got two older sisters, or had two older sisters. One passed away in 2014, and it was unexpected. She was 36 years old. And I vividly remember the circumstances surrounding it, which will sort of answer your question. But I was getting in bed on the night that I learned that she had passed away. Got a phone call from my oldest sister letting me know that she had passed away. So I got in my car in Jackson, Mississippi, and drove 3.5 hours. About 10 o'clock at night, left. Got down, picked up my oldest sister down on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And then she and I drove over to my mom's house to let my mom know that my sister had passed away. And so spent the night down there, got up the next morning, made all the funeral arrangements, and then drove back to get my family for the funeral. And I remember driving back from the Mississippi Gulf Coast back to Jackson to pick up my family, and like very distinctly having the thought that life was short and fragile, and time wasn't always going to be on your side, and that if you were going to do something, and this was sort of the mental dialogue for myself, if you're going to do something where you want to have a bigger impact, you can't wait. And so driving back that day, I made a commitment that within a year, I was no longer going to be practicing law, and I was going to do something in the world that I ultimately entered into. And so, I've recounted that a couple of times to friends in the past, and they've been like, "Oh, you had a eureka moment." And it really wasn't that. It was more, it had been there for a while. That desire had been there for a while, and I'd had my toe in the world for a while. But something about that experience said, okay, you need to take this from being a part-time sort of hobby and turn it into something that is your life. And true to form, within a year, I had left the practice of law and had launched the chapter of Americans for Prosperity in Mississippi.
A real leap of faith, Russ. That sounds scary.
Well, it didn't feel scary. I think if you talk to my wife, she might have said it was scary. I was at a point where partnership was right around the corner in my firm, so a lot of people thought, well, financially, this doesn't look like a great decision for you. I felt like what I was going to do and the long-term trajectory kind of made up for any differential in income, for lack of a better way to say it. And I also just felt like, hey, there are people at my law office who I like and respect, who are in their 50s, and who on a daily basis say they wish they had done something else. And so I don't want to be that guy that makes a decision, the safe decision now, and 20 years from now looks back on it and really regrets the fact that I went the safe route. And so to me, it didn't seem like that big of a jump. And it ended up being an incredibly rewarding jump. So,
I've seen in my own, I don't have the data to back this up, but just my own limited conversations with folks, that it seems like there's really two different types of groups of people that that come from families that had issues with food, or like not having enough money to put food on the plate, that sort of thing, or just low income backgrounds, that either they're willing to take those great risks and take those leaps like that, or they're the most like focused on what's the bottom line dollar that's out there, and very practical to that degree. You don't see them deviate from that. And there just doesn't generally seem to be much middle ground between the two. But it seems like you are a risk taker there. I mean, you wasn't scary, you said, and that you had been thinking about this for a while. But yet, like you pointed out, your wife might be on the other side of that. Tell me, put me more, what was her perspective of all of this?
So I don't think she was ever discouraging in any way. Like I can't recall any conversation where I thought, man, she really wishes I wouldn't do this, right? I just think I think there's a natural tendency um, when you're responsible for more than one person, right? Or where your decisions impact more than one person, to want to gravitate towards safety,
Mm,
right? And that's a very human thing, right?
yeah.
So I don't think that would be out of the ordinary for her. I, I'm interested and sort of intrigued by what you just said, though, about the natural tendency of maybe people who come up from low income backgrounds. First I'd say is like my background varied wildly depending on whether or not my dad had a big job going on or not. So there were some months where it felt like we were very much middle class, and there were some months where it felt like we were poor.
Mm,
And so, it wasn't like sort of a linear, sustained
mm,
poverty. It just was kind of like, hey, this month we can afford cable, and next month we can't.
mhm.
Uh, when you're living that, though, you don't really think about it. Like it just
Yeah.
becomes kind of the norm. Um, I would say though that if you've had that experience, if you've lived in a single wide mobile home, I have, right? If you've eaten government cheese, I have. That there's an element of like, well, I know what it can be like if you don't have a lot, and so this doesn't feel super risky because
Mm,
it's not like I was talking about taking a vow of poverty and becoming a monk, right? So it never felt like a huge risk. I think part of that too is at some level, um, kind of if you know your work ethic and you believe in yourself a little bit,
mm,
that it also doesn't feel like as much of a risk because it's kind of like, hey, I know that I'll get up at 4 o'clock in the morning if I need to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, right? And I'm going to do what it takes to make this successful. And if for some reason it's not successful, I believe the skills that God's given me and that we've developed will allow me to go do something else.
mm,
And so, I see this in our network all the time. I think there's this misperception in the general public sometimes that everybody that ends up in the line of work that we're in came from sort of privileged backgrounds.
mm,
And my experience, both with sort of SPN affiliates and when I was at Coke and the Stand Together Network, is that you had a lot of people who maybe didn't come up from poverty, but came up from relatively meager backgrounds. And those experiences helped shape the way they see the world and actually gave them a greater appreciation for the things that we're fighting for.
mm.
Right. So if you know that you started in poverty and no one in your family had ever gone to college, but this society has given you that opportunity to buy a house, to go to college, to live well, then you have a deeper appreciation for the fact that there's something unique and truly exceptional about our system. And I think that's true of a lot of people that end up in the line of work that we're in.
I think there's an appreciation for what America can do because we're grateful for what we have. And I see that pretty universally is that there has to be an element of gratefulness to want to do work like this.
You've seen the opportunity that comes from a system that is truly a free society. And yeah, I mean, there is a struggle unfolding right now for what it looks like in our country 20, 30 years from now, whether or not the American dream is real or can be realized. There are a lot of impediments to that right now. But I don't think those impediments are in place because of the thing that we're fighting for. I think the thing that we're fighting for has been eroded, right?
Hmm.
And so if we can restore in people faith in themselves that they have the ability to go out and earn success and find opportunity and create a life that is a life of meaning, um, then I think we push back against sort of a rise of what I would call authoritarianism on both the left and right. That's pretty pervasive. And so, I mean, if anything, the realized experience for a lot of people that do the work that we do shows that we can be successful in this country, that sort of our founding principles are good founding principles. And two, the sort of the threat to those things creates the urgency for the work that we're doing.
Hmm. That makes sense. Well, take me from making that leap into the unknown to now. How's that journey been?
It's been fun. I ran the AFP chapter in Mississippi for 3 years, and then went to Arlington in the DC area and oversaw Stand Together's economic opportunity portfolio. I think they call it economic progress now. But had an opportunity to really sort of craft strategy and development while I was up there. Great experience. COVID hits, and in 2020, moved back home to Mississippi. So came back to work with Grant Callen at Empower Mississippi. I was a founding board member of Empower back when it first launched, and that was before I'd left the practice of law, which goes back to that whole idea that I'd always kind of had my toe in things. But Grant had just been talking to me for, I don't know, a year or so about how he kind of wanted a partner who could help run the thing and help generate some big ideas and get legislative track going. And so came in and did that for 3 years. But in the back of my head, I have for a very long time had this thought that, like, if you were to look at where influence lies and what moves culture, that we're in this populist moment where part of what moves culture are, Kim Kardashians of the world, right? People who are influencers, who by virtue of saying buy this product or do this thing, have millions of people that are at least intrigued by the idea that they should follow that. But that also that media still plays this outsized role in moving discussions and framing narratives. And so, dating back even before I went up to DC, I had this thought in the back of my mind that really media was a bigger driver in some ways of the long-term trajectory of the country than the short-term work that think tanks were doing. And that work was very important, the short-term work. But I'd see us get legislation passed in places and almost immediately have a backlash against that legislation. And it raised questions about sustainability. And so in my head, it was like, hey, if you look at media, it's pervasive. It hits people every single day with a set of thoughts, right? And even for people who say they don't trust media, the end result of that drip every single day is that it eventually moves the conversation. It changes what politicians are willing to do and not willing to do. It changes the way that the general population sees issues. And on top of that sort of recognition was the recognition that media also is a pervasive threat if it is homogenous in thought, right? If you have a media that through story selection, that through who they choose to quote, where they choose to put quotes, how they choose to frame them, can change a narrative, that's dangerous if what they're doing is omitting part of the truth, right? And so for me, it was a recognition that, hey, this thing actually has a lot of impact in the way that people think about the world. And two, we're in an environment where an entire point of view is very frequently marginalized or left out of the conversation. Can there be something on the playing field that's not cartoonish, that's not trying to duplicate what sometimes the far left does through media, but instead sort of a Wall Street Journal approach, right? We're going to have really straight news, and then we're going to have commentary that leans conservative, but is not always conservative. And to the extent that we're offering commentary, we're going to label it that way. We're going to make sure it's evidence driven. And then we're going to offer people something a little bit different than the typical sort of state capitol reporter type outlet. We're going to do stuff on culture and business and the other aspects of life that kind of define the way that people see their world, right? And how they enjoy, for us, how they enjoy the state of Mississippi. So, we're doing a lot of stuff right now in our outlet that's culture focused, just to like remind people there are good things and good people out there. There are good places to eat. There's music to listen to. There's art going on all around you. There are cool little towns to explore. That there's more to life than these sort of constant debates. around
Hmm.
public policy. And so that thought had always been in the back of my head. Um, and when I moved back to Mississippi, what I saw was that the traditional sort of media has shriveled up to the point of almost non-existing, right? So that the big state print that used to dominate news and by extension dominated what television stations reported and what was talked about on social media, they just really didn't have the same resources anymore. They weren't producing the same content. And in their place, there were two different nonprofit news operations that had sprung up. Some good reporters at both, but they both distinctively have a progressive point of view. And that point of view at times, was pretty far out there, but helping to drive conversation. So it's like, hey, we need something that at the very minimum balances a media landscape that's gotten off kilter. It's a very long answer. I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize. Starting off, jumping back to the very beginning, you said that we're in a kind of Kim Kardashian driven culture. Is that something that's new, or is that kind of the human condition?
Um, oh, it's getting deep. I don't know that it's new. I think I vividly recall having a conversation with somebody within the movement several years back where I said, you got to realize that we are abnormal human beings,
Yeah,
and that we follow ideas.
yeah.
Most people don't follow ideas, they follow other people.
Hmm.
And particularly, they follow people that they think are strong.
Hmm.
And so it's not new that someone like a Kim Kardashian or Donald Trump would have people who wanted to do what they say, right? Or to live like them. I think we are in a uniquely populist moment, though. And I think in these populist moments, um, that becomes amplified. And so I think you see Republicans as an example who 10, 15 years ago would have been faith, family, freedom Republicans, who very much sort of subscribed to sort of William F. Buckley, Ronald Reagan, Milton Friedman type thought processes, that in a lot of cases now are jettisoning those thought processes just because one politician who happens to be strong is saying, no, now it means to be Republican, it means this,
Hmm.
right? Um, I think that's the first time in my lifetime that I've seen that.
Hmm. If that's the case, if that's where we're at, where we're more following right now, and you're seeing that there's this lack of media from one side, are you are you trying to speak to people like maybe you were answering that when you were saying you were focusing on culture as well as part of it, but does the Magnolia Tribune then try to speak in that way, or are you trying to call to people to think differently and less populist?
I think we're trying to call people to think differently. I alluded to earlier sort of an upbringing that included Christianity. I am a Christian. I don't think it's my job to develop a cult of people who like what Russ has to say, and I don't want that. I I do think there is a unique opportunity to remind people that there is a third way.
Hmm.
And so if I were to look at what's going on in society right now, I'd say that the greatest threat that we're facing is not the radical left or the radical right, it's convergence of the two. I think both sides, if you will, have become more authoritarian. And the reason that they fight each other so hard is they're actually battling over the same ground,
Mhm.
right? It used to be that in conservative circles, you would look at the world and you would say, we're distinct from the left. And the reason that we're distinct is that they want government to solve all the problems. And we believe that individuals should have the freedom to chart their own destinies. And the end result of that individual freedom is that people will find success and have more prosperity and well-being, right? I think what you hear now, both on the left and the right, is the same rhetoric, which is essentially we want government to have more power. And if government gains more power, then we can impose our will on the people who think differently than us. So I think for me, when I think about, if you want to think about like an editorial tone for the Magnolia Tribune, it's very much to say you don't have to take path A or B that are being offered to you right now. There is a third path that actually contrasts with both of these radical extremes, and that third path is individual freedom. It's trusting and believing in people again. And we've got a tremendous track record of success to sell you if you trust and believe in people, right? And so that's more in line with what we're trying to say from an editorial perspective. It makes it counterculture from on both sides.
Yeah. Well, Russ, find I find that vision that you painted of the fact that there is a lack and a need for the Magnolia Tribune, and that's what made you jump into it. And I find that what you painted incredibly, I resonate to it. It's exciting. I think, oh yeah, he's right. He's right. And that's why I'm asking these questions. It's like, okay, how is it like where are you charting now? Like where is that going? Do you find though, if you're trying to train people to not follow the populace, not follow the crowd, but this third way that you mentioned, is that a tougher sell? Are you losing out on reaching people that you could be reaching?
I'm sure at some level, right? I think there's a difference between popularity and impact, though,
Hmm.
right? And so I'll give an example. I think that, and maybe example is the wrong word. I think the tendency in populist movements is that you have this sort of frenetic pace and anger that drives these movements because the world isn't the way people want it, right? There's a lot of discomfort. There's uncertainty about the future. It drives people to these extreme poles. But in time, and historically speaking, most populist movements die out
Yeah.
because they are ineffective. They don't actually yield the results they get promised, right? And what people ultimately gravitate back towards is stability.
Hmm.
And so I think the long view is that, yeah, I could go out and say a bunch of incredibly populist things. I could be a grifter. I could exaggerate the other side, right? And get a lot of plaudits now. But when the world retreats to stability, I will be left without credibility, right? And so my view is that there's a place for people who are willing to say, here are the principles that I stand behind. Here's how we're going to argue things. We're going to argue in good faith. We're not going to put straw man against straw man. We're going to put steel man against steel man when we're having these discussions, because I think ultimately good ideas are still going to win. And if you don't like it right now, fine. But there will be a point in time where you look around and say, I think those folks were making sense, right? And in the meantime, we won't have lost our integrity chasing after what's popular now.
Hmm.
And so that's what's in my brain. I will tell you that so far it seems like there's an audience to that. And so, we acquired another outlet when we started Magnolia Tribune that had been a political blog for 18 years. We kind of got it and haven't used that brand at all, but started building essentially on some of what they already had. We've increased our readership 70% in a single year over where they were. We've got an email subscriber list that's over 70,000 people. And that's nearly triple where they were. Open rates of that same email have gone from about 18% that they were doing before to about 50% right now. Wow. So what we're seeing is that there is an appetite for this sort of in-state Wall Street Journal concept. And it's amazing that, I'll have folks who probably don't agree with me on a lot of issues will come to me and say, like, I still read your stuff every morning because it's interesting, right?
Mm.
Or it gives a credible viewpoint or perspective from the way that you see the world. And that's what we're going for. I mean, we just went through an election cycle where several outlets who really wanted a different outcome than the one that happened in Mississippi were pushing sort of outlandish narratives about what was about to happen in the election. And we were just slow and steady, reporting polling numbers and doing what I thought was pretty good deep dive analysis across the state. And the end result is that we called the governor's election in Mississippi on the nose. We said it was going to be 51-47. It was 51-47.
Mm.
And I had a bunch of folks who had been convinced that it was going to happen the opposite way because of the news media coverage come to me after the fact and said, I didn't like your reporting, but it turned out that you were spot on. And I'll take that because I think long term, those people are going to look at what we're doing and they're going to view it, even if they disagree with the point of view, they're going to view it as being credible.
That makes sense. That's exciting. That's exciting to hear. Well, tell me, I feel like you've shared some moments of impact that you've had, and I know we're running short. So can you, I'd love to get some encouragement from you. What's a time that maybe you've really faced a challenge or some sort of failure maybe, and how did you overcome that?
Yeah, so I think we don't have very much longer, do we? The there are several that I could point to. I think what I would say is that a lot of the challenge that I've faced in what we do has been when you have moments of fusion, right? So you bring together different kind of leadership visions, and there's this sort of tension over what's ultimately going to be the decision, right? Or in the case that I just described, right? We took on another entity that had existed for 18 years and decided that's not going to be our brand anymore, right? So that presented a challenge in the sense that there were people who were accustomed to doing things a certain way.
Yeah.
And you're saying, actually, we're going to change it completely, right? And so I think for a lot of people, when placed in those circumstances, when they hear we're going to change what you were already doing, that translates to, I think what you were already doing was wrong,
Mhm.
right? And so I think there's a natural sort of human defense mechanism built into that. My sense is the way that you overcome that is that instead of saying we're going to change what you're doing, you develop a common vision, right? And you say, what is it that if we were super successful, if we were just like having the most impact we could possibly have, what would that look like,
Mhm.
right? And instead of having a competition over visions, you construct the vision together. And then the conversation becomes, okay, what's the strategy to achieve this vision? All right. So it's not Russ's formulation of what a media outlet should look like. It's not anybody else's formulation of what a media outlet should look like. If we want to be an in-state Wall Street Journal, what are the things that we got to do to achieve that? And if you can start from that point, I think it's a lot easier to overcome those sort of fusion challenges. So that's one. I've probably got 15 others that I could spin off.
It makes sense. I think as a leader, you're called to be able to instill the vision. If you can't pass that on, we're not going to get anywhere. So I get that. That makes sense to me. So if you're going through challenges, what are some inspirations though that keep you going yourself, Russ?
Um, well, I mean, there's motivation, which is very much oriented to what we were talking about, off camera with family. Um, and there's also motivation in that, at this point in my life, Mississippi is home. I've lived here for most of my life. I can point to a handful of times where I lived in other places. I lived in New York. I came home to Mississippi. I lived in D.C. I came home to Mississippi. I lived in Nashville. I came home to Mississippi. And so this place has always drawn me home.
Hmm.
But I also recognize that there are just tremendous challenges here. And some of those challenges are generational. They've been here for decades and decades. a lot of the challenge here, I talked about believing in people. A lot of the challenge here is that Mississippians have sort of accepted the narrative about our state. You know, people say, well, you're 50th and everything, you're last and everything. And over time, that narrative seeps in and people begin to think, well, I can't do this by myself.
Hmm.
And so for me, I'm motivated to change the way that people think about themselves as much as I'm motivated to change any individual amount of public policy, right? Because I think if people can see themselves as free agents, right? If they can see themselves as capable and not have the mentality of being sort of deficient, then that's how things take off here, right? Because genetically, there's no difference between a person who lives in Mississippi and a person who lives in Florida or Texas or California. There's a psychological barrier sometimes. And so I'm motivated by this notion of like, how do we overcome the psychological impediments that occur in my state? I'm also motivated by the reality that I've got two children that are growing up here, and that I'd love to be able to stay here, right? Once they graduate and go to college and a place to raise a family. How do we create an environment where they ultimately are going to be proud of the fact that they're Mississippians? I'm inspired by a lot of different stuff, though, man. I see people all around the country who are doing good things, but I see people in Mississippi. There's a lady named Ashley Cephas in Mississippi who started this thing called Beanpad, and she could literally work anywhere. She's brilliant, huge tech background. She's chosen to make some very big investments and go out and find some very big investors to start a tech hub in Jackson, Mississippi, which is a city that's struggling, right? And you see something like that in a person that could be anywhere, and they decide to invest where you are, and you go, okay, there are other people who are thinking this way
Hmm.
and are willing to put their energy and their talents into it, and that gives you the motivation to kind of keep moving.
Well, beyond that example that you just made, which she sounds exceptional, it also struck me too that you're an antithesis to what you described about Mississippians. Well, oh, we're last anything, we can't do anything about it. I mean, I think of what you just shared with me, the fact that you uh, were the first or the second in your family to actually go to college, and not only do you go to college, you graduate, you get your JD, you go off and you're practicing law, and then okay, you're practicing law, that's great. But then all of a sudden you're about to make partner and you're like, I'm going to start Americans for Prosperity. And then you do that. And then you go off out of Mississippi and then you come back and you're working with Empower to helping grant do great things. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, no problem. I'm just going to start my own newspaper publication. Like this sort of attitude, like, oh, I can do this. Where does that come from? Because that doesn't seem common.
That's one of those questions that's like hard to answer because I don't
Sure.
see it. I don't see whatever you're describing, right? Um, I am driven by this idea of like finding the way to have a big impact. And I
Hmm.
I think this will sound weird, but I'll say it anyway. I think a lot of great achievement comes out of dissatisfaction. Um, and so I think if you look at innovation across our society, across human history, a lot of that innovation comes out of dissatisfaction. I am dissatisfied with the state of play, right? And I am scared of the thing I described earlier about this convergence around sort of big government control of business and everything else, um, because I think it ultimately destroys opportunity. And so for me, I think I'm just motivated by if what I'm doing right now is not going to have a bigger impact, what else can I do, right? And so um, I don't know if that answers your question, but I guess the short sort of negative answer is dissatisfaction drives me.
Okay. Sounds uncomfortable.
There's probably a positive formulation of that somewhere.
Well, maybe with more time we can flesh that out. But with the little time that we have left, are you able to share just some of your big goals that you have there for Magnolia Tribune?
Yeah, so I mean, our goal is from the get-go to tell Mississippi's true story, right? And I think if we do that in a way that is compelling, then the end result is that there's going to be positive developments and more opportunities for people in Mississippi. And so I'm not trying to be a think tank. I think, if we're delivering accurate information, if we're making sure that as big issues are being discussed, there is both sides of the equation on the playing field. We will have done our job. I think long term, we want to be the most read outlet in the state. It's possible that we want to be in more than one state. I think there are a lot of good people right now trying to figure out what the future of media looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, we'd like to be a part of designing something that helps to answer that question.
Okay. Well, exciting. I can't wait to hear and see more that's coming down the pike from y'all. Well, Russ, thank you so much for this conversation. I just have one last one. Are you able to nominate anyone for us to interview next here on Neighbors in the Network?
Yeah, have you talked to Dan Mead yet?
I haven't.
So Dan's up in Washington, ran the Washington Policy Center for a while, and is now doing something pretty innovative. It's like a capacities project up there, Project 42, I think it's called. But Dan would be my recommendation.
Perfect. We'll reach out to him offline. So Russ, thank you again. I found this conversation so interesting. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Neighbors in the Network, an offering from the State Policy Network. We hope that this podcast can serve as a place for empathy, understanding, and human connection. Please let us know about your thoughts in the comments section. And thanks again.